Hey, Parisi Nation, Steve Leo here, your host of the Parisi podcast. And I'm very honored to have the great Ken Clark on our call today. Ken is definitely a huge leader in our industry when it comes to speed development. He has done tons of research, has worked in the private sector, in schools, and really his knowledge base is a lot of what we've incorporated now into our programming, our manual, our education. So we're really, really lucky to have him on the call. And I'm going to try to, pick his brain on some things, but also see how can we take all of his knowledge that he's worked with some of the higher level athletes and bring it on down. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ken. I'll let you give your bio because you'll do a much better job than I will, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, thanks, Steve, for having me on, and to Parisi Nation. I've had a longstanding relationship with the Parisi Speed Schools and Bill himself, and so really, really happy to be here. My own personal background, multi-sport athlete as a kid growing up, come from a great family. I'm very blessed. My dad does biomedical research, but was also a coach. He's a high school football coach and a speed coach. And he's always interested in getting his players faster and then also helping me get faster. I always make the joke that I was never hugely genetically gifted. I'm small and weak, but I made up for it by being slow. So I was always trying to get better as an athlete myself. And that actually led me and my dad down to Parisi Speed School. I grew up in Connecticut with Mid-Atlantic roots. My dad took me down to Parisi Speed School when I was about 18 years old. This is back in 1998, so I'm dating myself there. And for a one-on-one session with Bill, really trying to work on my speed and specifically 40-yard dash time. I was very interested in playing college football, even at the small school level. And even back then, you needed to run a good 40 as a running back, which I was to get recruited. So that's kind of how I first got intertwined with Bill. And what became kind of, I guess, as a hobby growing up became a passion and then a career, fortunately, as it relates to, investigating running mechanics and coaching and all things speed. So I had a good Division III career as a running back. And after that, got into coaching, first football at the Division III level as a grad assistant. And then that kind of morphed over into strength and conditioning. I coached in a private sector at a place called Summit Sports in suburban Philadelphia for the better part of a decade in my 20s. Had a great experience there. There was just a ton of great coaches on staff that I learned from. And then ultimately got interested in a research side of things. So my undergrad degree at Swarthmore was ironically in psychology. They didn't have an exercise science program there. Of course, psychology is a big part of coaching and working with others and communicating, but nothing directly related to exercise science. And so I got my master's degree. I went back at the age of 28 and did my master's degree in kinesiology at Westchester University. Fell in love with the research process there. So I kind of did that master's degree, actually not really thinking that I was going to go get a doctorate or, go into research or academia or anything like that. I just needed some degree in exercise science and really fell in love with the research process during that time. My master's thesis was a training study on weighted sled pulling. So just for speed. And so I loved it. Went down to Dallas in 2010. And for 5 years, I was studying at Southern Methodist University in Dallas with Dr. Peter Wayan and Dr. Larry Ryan in the lab there. And, it was just a great experience. I know Bill knows Peter as well. And, it was an awesome time in my life where for 5 years, I just got to do nothing but investigate running and sprinting biomechanics, which is a pretty unique scenario. And then in 2015, when I had finished my PhD down there at SMU, Westchester University, which was my alma mater, they had an opening as a faculty member in biomechanics and motor learning. Actually, one of my old teachers had retired. So they offered me the job, and I was, really excited to come back to the Northeast part of the country. As I said, my roots are in Philly, and I kind of love the Mid-Atlantic region. And the other part that was really cool for me at Westchester is I could get to coach. So I teach classes, biomechanics, motor learning. I research, running mechanics. And then when my classes are done every day at 3 p.m., our track and football field is right outside our health sciences building. So I literally just walk down the hill from the classroom and work with the speed and power athletes on the track team. We've got a great a great head coach there at Westchester, Jason Kilgore, who lets me volunteer. And it's just an awesome way to keep my hand in all three things: teaching, researching, and coaching. And I just feel really blessed for kind of where I'm at now. Obviously, this year has been a little bit different for me, as it has been for everybody. Our education's remote and coaching looks a lot different, but great place to be. And I really have a great kind of hybrid combination job. And it's great for me to, when I moved back to the Philadelphia area, to take the job at Westchester to get reconnected to Bill and the Parisi Speed Schools. So it's been a great relationship for me in that way. So
yeah, it's tremendous, your background on where you started and how you worked your way through. And with the Swarthmore College, which is, people don't realize, that's a tough college to get into. That's kind of like the Harvard of liberal arts.
Playing
right?
football helped me get in. I'll just put it that way.
I know that. And then, and Westchester has always been known for, I've hired and definitely worked with people who've gone through the Westchester exercise science program. So they're very well touted. And, I think the big thing is, doing the research with Dr. Peter Wayans. I mean, his research to me is probably the best out there when it comes to speed development. And you can understand it. It's another way I'm going to look at it. I had the pleasure of seeing him speak at the Gain Network about 2-3 years ago. I'm part of that network, and I got to see him speak. And I know that we've done a lot of work, all of us together, listening to him. But I want to just tap into, when you were working with him, what were some of the things that were just kind of eye-popping that really changed your outlook? I mean, obviously you had a background and you kind of knew a lot about speed work from your days of playing and going through getting your master's, things like that. But what were some of the things that were those aha or wow moments that you kind of experienced?
Yeah, well, funny little backstory, not to rehash old times too much, but actually part of the timeline of all this was I visited Bill with my dad in 1998, and Peter's really famous study on vertical ground forces during top speed sprinting was published in the year 2000 while Peter was at Harvard. So my dad actually emailed Peter and was like, "Oh, this is great stuff. How do we apply this to getting our athletes faster?" And kind of the collective discussion is, well, that's kind of what we still got to figure out. Like, this is the mechanics of it, but now, how do we take this and basically translate it into coaching practice? And so that was like another interesting, email discussion that I was a part of with Peter, actually, when I was only 20 years old, a full decade before I ultimately went down and studied with him. But to your question, I'll stop rambling. To your question, Steve, probably the best thing about my time there in the SMU lab was, it was always really clear that we wanted to stick to the scientific method, first of all, and I'll get into that in a second. And second of all, do research that, was translational, that had practical applications. It's not, it's good to do research that's, you're up in an ivory tower and in a laboratory and you have good findings. But if you can't translate that into practice, then it loses some of its impact, pun intended, for our purposes here, right? So, with Peter and Larry and in the SMU lab, it was always like, well, what's our research question first? What are we really trying to look at? And when I got down there in 2010, as a following up on Peter's prior two really big studies on vertical ground reaction force and sprinting. And, those two studies kind of outlined the how are faster runners doing it compared to slower runners? Well, more vertical ground reaction force, less time, that sort of thing. Those two studies in 2000 and 2010 had outlined that, but the what and the why was still left unknown, basically. So when I got down there in 2010, I mean, I was so lucky. My doctoral dissertation question, outlining my entire studies was, well, let's figure out, why or what is allowing them to do this. And so everything else in a true scientific method sense really flowed from there. So Peter had some hypotheses as to, what was allowing them to do this. Basically, what we all know and love is front side mechanics, really attacking the ground, stiff contact, upon, the foot striking the ground. But that wasn't entirely known how that all interconnected when I got down there at that time. So that was kind of the working hypotheses. And then, between me and Peter and Larry and another doctoral student, Andrew Dofa, we tested over 115 athletes from all levels, male, female, literally Olympic gold medal winning sprinters, down to average Joes, team sport athletes, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, first responders, you name it. So Olympians to average Joes and everyone in between, and just basically teased out, what they were doing different. And so, that kind of goes to the first part of your question, which was, what was the eye-opening thing? Well, number one, just that good research comes from just asking good questions, formulating hypotheses, and then figuring out what you need to do to test that. And, I think we all learned the scientific method in seventh grade, but it was eye-opening to me to realize that the best research is coming just from adhering to that. The second part of it, though, is what I already mentioned, which was, you just mentioned a few seconds ago that like Peter's 2000 study really, is where the light bulb went off for you. It's like, hey, this is not just this is great research, but it's, it's impactful to what I'm going to do from a coaching standpoint. So, that was always impressed upon me during my time in SMU lab, which was, okay, well, this is good research. We need to follow the scientific method, but also what are the practical applications of this? We had coaches coming in and out of the lab all the time, interested in the findings. And so being able to clearly communicate, what we were learning and then how that was going to translate and impact the way that people could and should train differently, that was always impressed upon me as well. So, I think those are the two major, I guess, just 10,000 foot view philosophical things that I really learned there. We can, of course, get into the specifics of sprint mechanics in a minute here, but that's really the best thing that I picked up, macro level from my time in the SMU lab. And, as I've moved back to Westchester and, really continued upon that similar line of research at Westchester, I've tried to uphold that standard as best I can. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, if you've had a chance to read, Peter's studies, and even obviously a lot of the publications you put out, it all speaks to that. And obviously, talking about rate of force development, ground contact times, I think it's a lot of stuff that people kind of knew, and we did it maybe by accident. I think now the fact that we have some scientific research to support why we were doing things like bounding movements or, why getting stronger is important, real basic stuff that maybe we didn't fully understand. But I thought it was very interesting when I read through some of your stuff and Peter's, and then really talking about how you guys measured the force output with that treadmill, right? Which is amazing. That's probably the greatest toy ever, right?
Yep. Yeah.
That's a nice toy. A lot of people
hey, just round up $250,000 and you too can have yourself a custom built, world's fastest treadmill.
Yeah. So that thing is, obviously it's amazing. And one of the things I thought was very interesting, and I can't remember what study it was in or what publication, but talking about the limb speed, right? So obviously we need to apply force into the ground. We know vertical forces are very important, but one of the things I think it was Peter that wrote it, that the swing time on the front side is almost, trying to think of the right word. It's almost negligible compared to the force that goes on the ground, meaning compared to more of a general athlete, like Olympic athlete. Can you kind of explain that a little bit more? Because that was something that for me just popped out at me. I was like, wow, I always thought when you talk about stride frequency, the front side is so important to getting that leg into a ready position. So I don't know what your thoughts were on that.
It's a great question. I'm happy to speak on that. And yeah, that was one of the big outcomes of the 2000 study. And then some of our more recent research coming out of Westchester has kind of followed up on that a little bit. So, in the 2000 study, what they found, and this still holds up, is that if you look at basically an Olympic sprinter to a team sport athlete to an average Joe, what's referred to as swing time, or the time to reposition a limb from the right foot, toeing off behind a runner to the right foot touching down again in front of the runner, that limb reposition time, that's going to be basically the same between all runners, fast and slow, within a little bit of bandwidth. And frankly, you could use that term, within a little bit of bandwidth, to apply to everything, right? Within a little bit of variation, but that's going to be roughly a third of a second. Now, what's intriguing, and this is kind of where, some of the more recent research has gone, is that what's going on during that swing time is pretty different between faster runners and slower runners. So the time from toe off to touchdown, that swing time is about a third of a second, exactly like the 2000 study demonstrated and found. A couple of interesting things along the research timeline I can point out. So the forces, obviously, in faster runners are greater, the vertical forces. In our 2014 to 2017 studies, while I was down there, with SMU, at SMU, we found that the forces are greater, in particular during the first half of the ground contact phase. So that the second half of ground contact time, kind of counterintuitively, the forces are the same. Again, you look at Olympic sprinter, team sport athlete, it's basically going to be no difference between a guy that's running 11 meters a second and a guy that's running 9 meters a second. Where all of the difference is in the force application is in the first half of ground contact, and really like in the first third, within the first 30 milliseconds, 0.03 to 0.04 seconds. That's all the difference. It's faster than you can blink the eye. And then kind of where we continued on with that research, tied the force that was being applied to the motion of the limbs. So essentially, although the timing's the same, we all know that better sprinters are more upright, that they're more front side, to use, kind of a Ralph Mann term, that less of the thigh motion is happening behind the body and more is happening in front of the body. So it's putting them in what I like to phrase as good position to strike. I mean, basically they're recovering the limb in front of the body and now they're in good position to attack the ground. Then they're really winding up and striking the ground with an aggressive ground contact and a stiff ground contact upon initial touchdown, and that's resulting in big forces. And then what our most recent study from Westchester that was just published really about 6 months ago at this point, showed that those limb rotational velocities are also different between runners of different calibers. So the kind of the total time to swing the limbs is the same, but where that limb motion is taking place behind or in front of the body is different, and really how fast they are attacking the ground from that high knee lift position to ground contact is faster and faster runners than it is in slower runners. And so that's what's kind of setting up for the force application. So it's been, in my mind, I just feel lucky to be a part of it, but it's been this really cool kind of progression of research and building from Peter's study in 2000 and then 2010, and then our research at SMU, and Peter did those studies at Harvard, and then, our studies at SMU, which kind of detailed, well, when is the force happening? So now we're getting into the what and the why of it. And then, our most recent research, which has really shown, well, hey, from this kind of good front side mechanics, high knee lift position, really got to attack the ground. And the fancy term would be angular velocities. The faster runners have the faster angular velocity, which, think of it as Bruce Lee. I mean, all of his force isn't coming from just like this slow pressing. It's coming from that type of action. And that's what's really leading to the high vertical forces during the first portion of ground contact. So that's a really long-winded answer for me. Sorry, I tend to be long-winded, but that's kind of how that research all built on each other over about really 2 decades at this point. So
no, that helped. I mean, I think, a lot of times when we hear, okay, it's about vertical force, it's about the front side mechanic. Sometimes I think some people get confused on what that really means and what it looks like, right? When you talk about stride frequency, which is more of not an older term, but more the basic term, I think sometimes in my mind, people confuse that with kind of like the road runner, I call it the road runner, just quick legs or quick feet, like a soccer player.
Yeah.
Typically. Yeah. But what you're referring to, that leg velocity, that angular velocity coming into the ground, there is a speed involved there. That leg has to move quickly. It's not just about pure raw strength, which some people, you have those strength coaches that think, well, just get really, really strong, you'll have a better vertical force production. Again, not always the case.
Not always the case. Yeah. It is. I hate this because some people view it as a cop out, but it is kind of one of those, it depends things, right? So yeah. I always view strength for speed as like, in a lot of cases necessary, not always, but generally speaking, if I'm dealing with a younger athlete, and I know we'll get into this, but middle school, high school, is it a good goal to get that athlete as strong as possible relative to their body mass? Of course. I mean, to me, I view that as Captain Obvious, but will that always translate into large vertical forces during top speed running? No, not necessarily, because you have to have the mechanics that go along with it. And it's a little bit, the mechanics of large vertical forces at top speed are not necessarily the same thing as, a deadlift or a squat. But by no means am I saying don't deadlift or squat. I think those are great exercises. But anyways, yeah, it's it is interesting, just kind of back to the original question you just said about stride frequency. And you especially see this acceleration, but the same thing applies at top speed. I mean, yeah, in acceleration, a lot of team sport athletes, just spin the wheels, road runner style, like you said. what's missing is the range of motion that their limbs are working through. In coaching terms, big splits, big pushes. Frequency is good, but it has to go along with, frankly, the limbs working through the proper range of motion and an acceleration, really projecting your center of mass up and out. And it's really no different at top speed. I can have high frequency while I'm going through the quick foot ladder at 8 steps per second, but I'm not going to, that doesn't translate into a fast forward speed without the range of motion and the force application as well. So to my mind, that's the difference between exactly what you just said, which is just stride frequency versus kind of integrating that with some of these other variables as well. So
yeah, and then obviously, if you go into stride length, which really in our minds, we view it a couple different ways. One, you have more of your actual stride length, which is if you just wanted to measure, if you could do like a strider, old school strider, or what's your effective stride length, meaning your projection of your center of mass. And we try to look at that, and with kids, it's not as easy, right? It's definitely not as easy with like a 13, 14-year-old, because there's so many mechanical errors that you're trying to work through, But one of the biggest challenges that we've seen, and we're trying to attack it a little bit more, is we're getting kids stronger. We definitely believe in that. I agree with you. Our term is get them strong enough, like you said, just strong enough. But, if I pull 50 more pounds in a deadlift, that may not translate to my sprinting. And it actually could be a detriment. It could overtrain you, hurt you. I mean, it's definitely, we know things that could happen. But one of the things that we've noticed is a lot of yielding or leaking at the ankle joint when they're striking the ground. Yeah. Now, we know they need to have a big punch, right? And I use the same terms you do use. I probably stole them from you, is that punch into the ground. We all
steal them from somebody, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You got to punch the ground, but it's that fine line of punching the ground and, like you said, hitting the ground with a lot of force, but then you have to be able to get off the ground quickly. And if there's a yielding there, that could be an issue. And then on the other end of the spectrum, which Bill's done a lot of research, having that stiffness prior to contact. So there's a lot going on at that ankle joint. So basically, what are your feelings on ankle stiffness versus ankle mobility at ground contact time?
Yeah, wow. Awesome line of questions and just a really cool discussion topic. So let's talk about ankle range of motion and I guess proper, mobility for starters. That might be the easier one to talk about. Clearly, athletes need to have, acceptable levels of ankle mobility, dorsiflexion, whatever the case may be, so that they can execute just the basic movement patterns correctly, right? I mean, if they don't have proper ankle dorsiflexion, it may limit them in a squatting movement or something like that, right? So they need to have just, in low speed movements, the proper range of motion at the ankle joint. With that being said, to all of your points about stiffness and optimal levels of stiffness during top speed sprinting, there's got to be a certain amount of pre-tension that occurs before contact and dynamic stability that occurs so that when the foot contacts the ground and you've got 4 to 5 times body weight of force, going up through the musculoskeletal system within the first 25 milliseconds, the whole thing doesn't just collapse into the ground with excessive yielding, like you said. So I've always viewed kind of 2 basic pathways to try to improve this. I want to make, I guess, one clarifying point, because this has always been brought to my attention and it's a good one. There's some optimal level of stiffness. It's not maximal stiffness. I mean, if it's maximal stiffness, then the system just, basically breaks, right? So there's some optimal level of stiffness. That's hard to define. To your point, you want to see the athlete stiff enough that they can punch the ground and pop off of it without any excessive yielding. From a very qualitative standpoint, that's what I always define as optimal stiffness. So how do we get there? So I think it can be addressed in 2 ways with like a developmental athlete. For starters, I think, this is where plyometrics come in really handy, and just the basic ones. I mean, this is where your pogo hops or your ankle bounces, whatever you want to call them, your rudiment series. This is where that really helps translate what you're doing in the weight room and with your technique drills and just your overall speed work, and helps them develop that from a neuromuscular standpoint and just develop the feeling of, hey, the ground's coming up to meet me as I descend downward towards the ground. When do I need to turn things on? Because when you're just sprinting at 4 to 5 steps per second, that's happening too fast. So plyometrics are not only a good way just to literally, perhaps build that from a neuromuscular standpoint, but also just to kind of train, okay, hey, I need to turn on now before you strike the ground. And then I think, that's where technique work comes into play. And I know there's a little bit of a social media debate out there between, how much good do drills do? And I always view it like this, which is, well, you need to warm up your athletes somehow. You can't just go send them into, full speed 40s or 60s cold. So if you have to do a dynamic warm up, and of course, Parisi Speed School is famous for its dynamic warm up, then your warm up drills at some point in your warm up progression should have speed technique drills in them so that your athlete is, contacting the ground, and you can be cueing them on what that should look like and how it should feel like. And so I think that's a great way to develop it from a technique standpoint. So I guess going back to kind of the two pathways to get at it, number one is just, developing it, training it. And I really see plyometrics, and they don't even have to be the complicated ones, but just basic plyometrics as that linkage there. And on the technical side of it, just drilling it, even in your warm-up exercise. And I love the simple, basic ones where you get a lot of bang for your buck, the A march, A skip, A run, the dribble step overs, the straight leg runs, the bounds, as you were saying, where you're just kind of cueing it and watching for it and giving the athlete a context to feel that out. What should it feel like when I'm popping the ground on the ball of the foot and being reactive? I'll just have, I guess, one other comment. Athletes, you can really tell when an athlete is striking the ground well, not just at sprinting, but I think in a lot of those warm-up type drills. Just because they can do it when they do an A march or a step over doesn't guarantee that they can do it in a sprint. But it really gives you an opportunity to view it as a coach during their warm-up and see if they're getting the feel for how to contact the ground. And from there, if they have the feel for how to do it in an A march, in a dribble, in a straight leg run, then it becomes easier to cue and say, okay, the way you're contacting the ground here in your warm-up, you got to contact the ground like that when you sprint. So that's kind of how I see, ways to improve that. As you mentioned, absolutely critical component of applying a lot of force and running fast. So.
Listen, I couldn't agree with you any more than everything you said there. I mean, when it comes to our warm-up, obviously, we're known for having a very long and detailed warm-up, but we're proud of that because, one, I think it preps people the right way, increases all of the different pathways that we need for them to sprint. And we utilize those drills as movement prep, right? That's probably the strength conditioning term out there, as movement prep. But the other thing we try to do, we look at the drills as a stimulus as well. We're trying to stimulate them to feel something. Like you said, hit the ground. Because if you tell a kid to do a skip, they're going to skip like they're skipping through the park, right? You go to any track meet. I'm a track coach. So you go to any track meet, any football field, the kids are just, kind of getting their swag going. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's okay. But
it's not a technique drill, right?
No. And there's no intent to it sometimes. You know what I mean? And like you said, learning how to attack the ground from above, or use, some other famous terms like whip from the hip, things like that. That's a boss
term, and I think that's a great one. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think the other thing too is every kid doesn't always, I don't know how you feel about this, but I don't feel every kid always gets every one of those cues or drills. So sometimes you have to switch over and do something else to stimulate them the right way.
Yeah. I 100% agree. I mean, we definitely see things from the same lens, right? I mean, an athlete may not be able to feel that in one drill, as you just said, but in another one for them. And then that's your in to say, hey, if that athlete was able to do it, let's say in a step over drill, a dribble, but they couldn't in an A march, whatever. But then you reference the step over or the dribble, and you say, hey, the way you were contacting the ground there, that's the way you need to do it, when you sprint. I'll put in one other little side note here, because I get asked this question a lot. I do this more with my team sport athletes. I train a few just team sport athletes and private clients in addition during the summer, in addition to working with the track team at Westchester. But do a lot of what I would term technical build-ups or technical flies with those athletes to finish off the warm-up. So maybe they're not a full speed flying sprint, but it's kind of right at the end of the warm-up and right before we're truly getting to our full speed max velocity sprints. We'll do just 2 or 3, at 90 or 95%, whatever that means to the athlete. Some athletes can gauge what that is, and others are just like, hey, just a little less than full speed. But just focusing them or cueing them to focus on that ground contact. Athletes can usually only think about one thing at a time when they're running fast, and perhaps zero things at a time when it's truly time to go all out. But at like a 90% type of gearing, I find I've had good success with the athletes being able to focus on one technical cue and just say, so if it's an athlete that struggles with foot strike, for example, with ground contact, say, okay, hey, you're going to do a technical fly, build up 0 to 20. I want 90%, 20 to 40, and then you're going to take a long decel after that. The only thing you're focusing on is how you're contacting the ground. Just, punching the ground on the ball of the foot, and that's it. And on those reps, they can kind of dial in a little bit, and it leads to some good progress over time with doing that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I've done fly sprints for a long time, but never really worried about what not the distances, but what the intent was. Right.
Yeah.
And I've started timing them a little bit more, which is challenging if you don't have a system to do that. I'm doing it with a stopwatch, but getting them to feel the ability to, whether it be accelerate, in the beginning of a sprint, or with track athletes, they may have to, come out of their flow and accelerate on a turn or something like that. I think that feel is the biggest thing that you said. And when you're working with kids, they can feel things, right? You can let them know, hey, how did that feel? Oh, I felt slow on that one, or I felt like my arms weren't moving. Because I think as coaches, and this is my opinion, I've talked way too much as a coach. I've told them too many things.
I always do that, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, your arms, your head. I'm like, sometimes it's got to be a feel thing. And and the other thing that we've been trying to use more is, use the stopwatch as your friend. To get them to understand, like you said before, you tell a kid to do a 95% sprint. They don't really know sometimes.
Yeah, they don't know what that is a lot of times. Yeah, especially now with younger athletes. Yeah, so when I do like with team sport athletes and use like a just a Brower timing system or something like that. I mean, I may give a like a 90% cue, but more often than not, I'll actually say, hey, full time on this is X. So if an athlete is runs a 1 flat flying 10, I'll just say, hey, goal time is a 1-1. This isn't full speed. And that typically clicks a little bit better than, some athletes aren't too good with those percentages, which is understandable. So,
and it's funny, because I work with a lot of high level academic kids at the school I'm at. These kids in AP physics, AP calculus, all that stuff. You tell them to do simple math in their head, they can't do it. So
that's right.
it's like, what is that? I'm like, just do this. But anyway, I think we've all dealt with that with kids. But again, I think that's the human side of coaching that sometimes we may forget about.
Definitely.
I know for myself, I read a ton, I've researched a ton, and I get to the track and I'm like, okay, these are all the things I want to do. And then I realize I'm going to do like 2 of those today because they're just not going to be able to absorb it all.
No, I think it's always, you got to come in with a plan, and then, got to understand that the athletes are humans, and you got to adjust it, as you see fit to get the most bang for the buck, no doubt. So,
because, it can stress them out at times. I'm sure you've dealt with that where you're trying to make an adjustment or change something. And sometimes it goes the other way. I don't know if you've ever had that happen, but they get worse from all your coaching.
I mean, especially if you're trying to change mechanics, which I think is a really important point. I actually talk about this in motor learning class with my students, but it's no different, teaching any skill to an athlete. And, for developmental athletes, middle school and above, a lot of times it's the first time they've been taught how to run. If they're a baseball player, they've been taught how to throw and how to swing a bat, but they've never been taught running mechanics. And so, teaching them that skill for the first time at 12, 14, 16, whatever, it doesn't always feel good. That also comes up a lot, like with our Westchester sprinters. If we're trying to make a relatively fine-tuned change with one of our athletes, they might do it right and do what we're looking for, and it doesn't always feel good to them, and that's okay. We try to be pretty clear with our communication that what feels right to them, we don't try to be jerks with this, but what feels right isn't always right. So sometimes they have to make a change that doesn't feel great at first, and just kind of trust, to use the cliche, trust the process that will ultimately be better long-term from a mechanical standpoint. But yeah.
I mean, anytime you're making a change, it's uncomfortable, right? It's just uncomfortable for the game.
It's different. So,
and they'll tell you that. And trust me, kids are they're much more honest than they used to be.
They're not going to hold back, right?
They don't hold back, and they tell you. But I think that's what you have to understand. And I don't know how you feel, but I tell the kids every day, listen, we're just going to try to work on one thing today. We're not going to try to change everything. We're not going to try to do acceleration, transitional speed, top speed all in one day. It's just a lot for them to handle. Although one of the things I want to ask about that we're making a little bit of a mind shift to, it's something I've always believed in, is when you're talking about linear speed, acceleration and top speed, they're not separate countries, so to speak. You know, they do relate very well. And you have to understand that you need to learn how to basically stand up with good posture, strike the ground, and that will transfer over to acceleration. It'll transfer over to multi-directional. So we do a lot of the drills that you were talking about in the beginning, more the mock drills, but different versions and the sticks and the aqua bags. But getting them to understand that first. And a lot of people will say, well, is that top speed acceleration? I'm like, it's just running. I'm teaching them how to run first.
I agree. Yeah. No, I absolutely see it from the same perspective. I mean, if you ask how like a weekly layout plan would look for our sprinters, you know, in a fall preparatory period, it would be typically one day a week is excel and another day is top speed, another day speed endurance, or from, you know, working with a team sport athlete over a summer, you know, same sort of thing where one day is excel, top speed, and another day is change direction, agility. But with that being said, to your point, I mean, I like whatever analogy you just used. They're, you know, they may be different. They may be different states, but they're not different countries, or whatever the phrase you just used is, right? Yeah, I mean, they're definitely related. You definitely need to be able to just understand good general running mechanics if you hope to execute, you know, a nice gradual transition, you know, throughout acceleration into top speed. And, you know, I think one thing that's often overlooked is that although from like a biomechanics standpoint, you know, it's really easy to point out what the differences are, right? Where the force vector's angled from acceleration to top speed, differences in contact and flight times, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, it's easy to point out the differences, and they exist. So I'm not trying to say they don't. One thing that was eye-opening, I guess going back to your question from a half hour ago, I was lucky enough at SMU to work with some really great sprinters, like world-class sprinters on the treadmill, and then subsequent to that, get them out on the track and do some acceleration-based work and videotape it. And it just became clear to me that whether they knew it or not, their strategy, I mean, really their motor program was universal. It was, hey, good posture, good neutral posture, regardless of what phase of the sprint. Attack the ground underneath the hips. You know, strike the ground, you know, with the relatively stiff ground contact. Don't let the thigh swing too far behind the body. All of these things, you know, translate literally and figuratively, or transfer from excel to top speed. So yeah, I mean, to your point, good mechanics are good mechanics, you know, in any phase of the race. Do we need to practice them separately? I mean, yeah, I think to really hone in on, you know, the specificity of each phase, you do, to make sure the athlete can master it. But in a much more global sense, I mean, you just need to understand kind of the basic big rocks that underlie all of that. So yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, probably that's what we do. You know, if you look at kids that would train with us, or even with my track team, I follow basically the same format. One day is an acceleration day. One day is a top speed day. One day might be more that speed endurance or special endurance day.
Yeah.
But what I think people forget is, if you're working on acceleration, in my mind, once we've worked on whatever it might be, the mechanics or the transition or the rise phase, whatever we've done that day, we still want to incorporate it with that full sprint. And I think people forget, like, hey, I can run past 10 yards. It's okay. You know, you don't have to just run 10 or 15 yards for acceleration. Run 25, 30 and feel that transition.
The other thing I would add is, and, you know, I'm known for, you know, perhaps my research and I guess more emphasis on maximum velocity, but if you're coaching an athlete's doing a max velocity day, if they're doing a full speed fly, you can't run a good top speed session, top speed segment, let's say from 30 to 40 meters, unless you really, you know, have pedal to the metal during acceleration. I mean, a good acceleration has to precede that max velocity segment. So, you know, on a true all effort max velocity. So yeah, I mean, I think there's way more overlap than you know, sometimes is given credit to. So yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, to me, for a kid, they have to feel what it's like to put it together. Because I think we forget, we train them in our bubble, but they're going to leave our bubble and go to their sport. And I want them to feel what it feels like for them to be on a field, a track, a court, whatever it is. So try to put them in a situation where, hey, this is you hitting the hole as a running back, or this is you going down on a kickoff. So I try to put that in their mindset first, and then, okay, we're going to do a 20-yard fly or a 30-yard fly or whatever we have on tap for that day. Because if you don't relate it back to their sport, no offense, they don't care how much we know.
No, you're not going to get the intrinsic motivation and buy-in from them if they don't see it translating to their sport. You're right. They're not going to care, to put it in simpler words. Yeah.
I say it every day. The kid does not care how smart I am. They just care, can I get them better? That's all they care about.
Yep.
So we're trying to do that as best we can. I want to ask you one more question that might be complicated and long, but I'm very intrigued. I've read a lot about your two-mass model. I agree. I don't fully get it. I'm going to be honest with you. So maybe
that's okay.
I want to get it is the problem. I think I understand it, but maybe you could touch upon it, because you've definitely done a lot of presentations in the last couple of years. I know you spoke at Altus about it, and I think that's where I probably first saw it. I'm a member, I get the subscription on Altus, and it was great. Sure. I've watched it probably 5 or 6 times, but maybe you could break it down to us. Where did that come from your mind? It's probably definitely stemmed from your work with Peter, right?
Yeah. So that, no, I'm happy to talk about it. And, I think the key thing about that, the two-mass model, is not to, feel the need to dig into every single one of the equations of the paper and kind of understand a formulation per se, unless you want, but more so just the big picture that comes out of that from a practical application standpoint. Happy to talk about that. That was part of my doctoral dissertation work down there at the SMU locomotor lab. And actually, to a large degree, that has a primary role in some of the factors we already talked about probably 20 minutes ago for the greater vertical forces and the faster runners and the why that's happening basically. But yeah, I'll definitely take us through it now. So the science of it is, we noticed that the faster runners had more force in the first half of ground contact. And we also noticed that the lower limb, and this kind of comes into the aggressive ground contact. We were doing a research, we had kinematics, so motion-based data on these runners. And we noticed that the faster runners had faster vertical velocities of the lower limb into the ground at ground contact. So in other words, as we discussed previously, even though the total time to reposition the limb was the same, fast and slow, but what the runners were doing from a high knee point to when they struck the ground, the faster runners were doing that faster. It had a faster touchdown velocity, you could say. We also noticed that they were decelerating the limb upon ground contact quicker. It's literally just the punch and stiffness topics that we've already talked about. So when you put those two together, a fast vertical touchdown velocity and a stiff ground contact, a fast deceleration, what you get just kind of from Newton's laws is a lot of force in the early part of ground contact. So that's how we first noticed it. Was just like, well, hey, these faster runners are getting all of their forces or more force in the first part of ground contact. And if we're playing Sherlock Holmes, their lower limbs going faster at touchdown than the slower guys are. And upon contact, they're stopping it. So that's where it all originated from. And then what we noticed, though, was that it wasn't just at top speeds where we could kind of start to pick out these differences. We could also see, like, when heel strikers, even at like submaximal jogging speeds, they would strike the ground, their force waveform kind of took on this specific, what we term signature. It just looked a certain way. And if somebody ran really high on their tiptoes, like a soccer player at, kind of a jogging speed, it had this really smooth kind of the inverted sine wave looking type of form, an upside down U. So we, in kind of a qualitative sense, started to be able to, we could just look at the force trace and know how fast somebody was running and how they were striking the ground. It was kind of cool in a very nerdy way. So then that really led us to say, okay, well, can we form a model that explains this? And so the two-mass model was basically connecting the dots between the motions of the limb right before ground contact and during the first portion of ground contact, and the forces that related, and the forces that resulted, I should say. Now, there's been a lot of other models that came before this. They're all great. All models build on each other. What was kind of cool about the two-mass model in my mind was we built on a study from 1991 by Bobbert and colleagues, and they had like 7 masses that modeled the body. And we said, well, this is an incredible study. It used Newton's laws. Can we take those 7 and just boil it down to 2? The first one is just the lower limb. It's just the foot and the shank. And the second mass is just everything else. We'll just call it everything else. And can we just kind of take some simple parameters, contact time, flight time, the incoming velocity of the limb, and just use those in the runner's body weight and predict the force curves. And we could ultimately, with a lot of refinement over 5 years, from everything from a jogging speed, 3 meters a second, which is 7 miles an hour, all the way up to a top speed sprint of 11 meters a second. Some of our Olympians, 25 miles an hour. So, and it was, really effective. It was just, it was a joy to be a part of that research. It was 95% or more effective over all of those traces. And, that's kind of I guess you could say the more in the weeds science of it, but the practical applications are this: to get the big vertical forces and short ground contact times, which you need for fast sprinting. We come back to just pure coaching application. That comes from fast limb velocities into the ground and a stiff ground contact. Everything that you and I have been talking about for the last half hour. And that's where all the punch the ground or pop off the ground. And, how do we address this with plyometrics? That's funnels into all of this. And then even our more recent research that kind of looked at the angular velocity of the limb and how that sets it up. So it all kind of plays into this practical application, which is, why are these elite sprinters applying more force? And why is it in the first half of ground contact? Well, the two-mass model helps explain that. So if I had to give one takeaway about the two-mass model, certainly from an applied standpoint or a coaching standpoint, it's much less the in the weeds of, well, how do we, go about formulating it, and how did it, perhaps translate it to slower jogging speeds? Because maybe to a coach or a practitioner, it doesn't even matter. But what does that mean from a coaching standpoint? It's everything we just talked about. What do you need to do to run fast? Good posture, good front side mechanics, attack the ground with a fast angular velocity. That leads to a fast touchdown velocity, punch the ground stiff, and away you go. So to me, that's kind of my two-mass model, from scientific in the weeds to coaching practical applications of it. So hopefully that helps. Or I don't know, or maybe you just want to pop on the video of my presentation. It'll be better. I'm not sure.
It did. It did crystallize it. It is sometimes when you're trying to get these concepts, you overthink them. And it is everything that we're trying to accomplish. I think the hardest thing for us is when you're dealing with younger athletes. There's other factors that aren't there yet. You know what I mean? They're maybe not strong enough yet. They can't hold the position.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we struggle as coaches, and I know a lot. I do a lot of education, so we get a lot of these questions. It's a typical, hey, what other drill should I do? And sometimes I just want, they need to just sprint more too. Part of it is that you just need to run more. I got to
ask this question. No, sorry, I didn't mean to interject. I got to ask this question on social media, actually, by a friend of mine, guy I used to coach with. It was a great question. He's a great personal trainer and strength and conditioning coach, but he mostly works in swimming. He doesn't deal with that many athletes who are ground-based trying to get faster. But I guess just due to general curiosity, or maybe he's working with some ground-based athlete, I don't know. He asked me, how do I train to apply more ground force? Like the most general question ever. And I just wrote back, I was like, well, that probably requires a 2-hour phone call. But if I had to break it down for like a developmental athlete, kind of to your point, I would say, well, in the weight room, try to get as strong as you can relative to body mass. That's always the key. Strong as you can relative to body mass in the major, compound multi-joint lifts, squat, deadlift, some of the Olympic derivations. Do the basic plyometrics really well to help the weight room transfer to the turf. And again, I think you can get a ton of benefit of just doing the pogo jumps, the rudiment series, mini hurdle hops. I mean, it does not need to be super complicated, but bilateral and unilateral when the athlete's ready for it. Work on technique and mechanics, both in the warm-up drills themselves, and then with things like technical build-offs or other technical flies. And then, as you said, just sprint, because a lot of athletes just need to run fast or run fast. I think with the caveat that, hey, we want to make sure our athletes have some degree of technical competency before we just, set them loose so that they're not, at a high risk of injury. But yeah, I think, as you said, with developmental athletes, I think a basic approach can be really effective. And that's not basic in a negative sense at all. It's just, hey, what are the foundational steps we can take? Get them stronger, do the basic plyos well, work on technique with every opportunity you have, and sprint fast. And if you do those four things, you're probably going to put the athlete on the right path to improve their speed and overall athleticism. So
that's a great way to summarize. And really, that's really who we are as a company. So it's great to hear it from you, because it's really everything that we preach is what you said. And I know basic, unfortunately, gets a bad rap as a word when it comes to training.
Right? Yeah.
Fundamentals, whatever terms you want to use, but one of the
fundamental
things
somehow has a better connotation than basic,
fun.
Right? That's right.
But you get kids. I think one of the things that I've noticed is kids, they just don't run fast anyway. If you go to a lot of practices for other sports, they may not sprint in practice. It's right. Doing plays or playing defense, which is all important stuff. But when they have to really turn it on and sprint, sometimes they're actually shocked. They do a few of them with us. They do a couple 40s and they're done. 3 40s in, they can't even sprint anymore. And I'm like, well, this should tell you something, guys, that we need to work on your work capacity and your speed endurance. But then you get the other end of the spectrum. You have a soccer player or someone, and they're, I call it the death march. They run their guts out 3, 4, right. 5, 6 miles. So it goes back and forth, and it's something that we
right.
Yeah, it's not easy, and and everyone has just different philosophies. Short to long, long to short. You get to that when it comes to track and field, but we're trying to mitigate in the middle there and say, listen, we're just trying to prep you and give you back to your sport, and hopefully we made you a better athlete. But I think one of the things that I try to say is I don't think athletes realize that it's weird, but speed takes time. It takes time for it to happen. It's not like weights. You get strong in a week. You could lift 100 pounds this week, 120 next week. Wow. But speed could take months, even years.
Yeah, to really develop good mechanics if you didn't have them naturally and to really get faster. Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a long-term process, no doubt.
Yeah.
So,
well, hopefully everyone will go back and rewind this and listen to it a few times. I'm definitely going to. This is unbelievable. I'm very, very honored, number one, to have you on. I've definitely followed you forever. So this has been great for our network and everyone else out there. I thank you so much for your time. How can people hit you up? I know you just started your own website, and if you want to drop
well, first of all, thank you for having me on. Thanks to Bill. Love the Parisi Speed School and happy to be affiliated with it. And on social media, at Ken Clark Speed, all one word, KENCLARK Speed. And then, just recently, launched a website about 6 months ago at this point. That's kenclarkspeed.com. And, have everything there from kind of information about research and podcasts and other social media things, as well as some drill videos and just link to everything that we got going on from a speed standpoint. So that's where to find me. And I just wanted to say thanks again, and thanks to the audience for listening. And definitely reach out to me if you're in the audience and you have some follow-up questions afterwards. So.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, guys, definitely, he's one of the people that you want to follow. And one of the compliments I want to give to you as well is I think you put everything in real terms. I know sometimes you are a science guy, right? That is your background, but I've been able to follow.
You got to be able to wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
So, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. It's, I love guys like Bosch and stuff, but I get confused. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes, I'm like, man, I don't know what wavelength I'm on right now, but your stuff has definitely been a little bit more digestible, if that makes sense. No,
it does. I appreciate that for sure.
But we definitely thank you, and hopefully we can do a follow up at some point. And everyone definitely needs to check all your information out and anything you have out there. It's great stuff. So we really, really appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks again, Steve. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.